During the third week of October in 1973, at the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers 114th Technical Conference and Equipment Exhibit held at the Americana Hotel in New York City, two cameras were introduced. First was the Cinematographers CP16R, and second was the Ikigami HL33. One was celebrated with announcements, articles, and advertisements in the trade journals. The other one was largely ignored. 50 years on, the one that was overlooked today is celebrated for its impact on the business of image acquisition, while the one that is celebrated is largely forgotten. In this video, we will look at the history that led to these two cameras facing off in the technical revolution that swept through the business of image gathering in the mid-70s, and why no one was able to predict the eventual outcome. We will do this by following the careers of two engineers who led the effort to bring these two cameras into existence, Edmund Giulio and Joseph Flaherty Jr. Ed Giulio was born on the 13th of June in 1927 and graduated from the Columbia School of Engineering and Applied Science in 1950. He then spent a decade working for the computer giant IBM. In the early 60s, he went to work for Mitchell Camera in Glendale, California, about 6.5 miles north of LA. Mitchell had been around since 1919. Their cameras were the preferred machines for making movies in Hollywood. The big breakthrough that made their camera so popular was their rack-over system to allow for through-the-lens focus and composition. Here's a video by cinematographer Sam Dodge explaining how viewfinders worked back in the old days.
And the camera is a rack-over camera, and I'll explain what that is. Reflex viewing hadn't been invented yet, so an operator couldn't look through the camera while it was running. So in order to set up his scene, what he would do is he would rack the camera over, push a button on the T-handle, and what that does is rack the camera and the magazine, the film, away from the back of the lens and line up the operator's eyepiece with the lens so the operator could look on a ground glass and set critical focus and set his framing, and when he was ready to shoot, then he would rack the camera back over and put the film behind the lens, and he would operate by using the side finder with just a little parallax.
The German company Arri came up with a viewfinder that allowed for through-the-lens viewing in their line of motion picture cameras in the 30s. The mechanism was called a reflex. The cameras worked so well that they were prized possessions when captured from the Nazis during World War II. The only drawback to their design was that the machines were noisy. You couldn't have a mirror rapidly spinning in a metal camera without some sound being produced. About the same time Arri introduced its reflex camera design, Mitchell Camera back in Hollywood had come up with a super quiet camera, the NC or news camera. It was equipped with a very precisely engineered movement that moved the film past the revolving shutter with little noise. When equipped with a blimp, no sound was heard from the machinery at all. Their BNC or blimp news camera was the main film camera in use in Hollywood by the time Giulio came to work for them. During his 5 years at the company, he designed a motorized zoom control and, more importantly, a mechanism to reflex the BNC. Here's cinematographer Sam Dodge again with an example of the camera.
This is a Mitchell BNCR, nearly one of the first BNCRs. It was first sold to Allied Artist Pictures in March of 1955. The same month they started shooting Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and was converted to a reflex camera as soon as reflexing became possible.
Dodge made that video in 2016, before the American Society of Cinematographers monthly magazine's archive was put online with the marvelous search tool that allows one to search the entire catalog for terms like reflex. Given this sort of tool, he would have found an ad in a March issue of 1968 announcing the availability of reflex conversion to Mitchell BNC owners. He also would have seen the announcement of Giulio's Academy Award for the conversion in the May issue of 1969. And of course, he wouldn't have missed a full-page ad in the January issue in 1969 where Giulio explains the economic benefits of the conversion. Giulio, who is now out on his own and started the Cinema Products Company, was able to convert around 25 cameras a year, bringing between $10,000 and $15,000 to the company for each camera. With this tidy sum in hand, he then turned his attention to another market in the image acquisition industry, namely 16mm cameras. 16mm film was introduced in May of 1923 with the unfortunate designation as a substandard film. To attendees at the Society's 13th Technical Conference and Equipment Exhibit held in Atlantic City that year. American Cinematographer magazine wrote up the new format in their January 1924 issue, announcing that Eastman Kodak had brought motion picture photography to the novice. Pretty soon, Bolex and Bell and Howell came out with a camera for the new format as well. All these cameras operated with a spring. You wound them up, and then you press the button, and the energy from the spring would push the film through the camera. It wouldn't last very long, which is why 16mm always continued to be an amateur pursuit. Also during this time, professional cinematographers dismissed the gauge as really not worth the time. But then Eastman Kodak came up with Kodachrome in 1935, and suddenly there was renewed interest in a little gauge that could. At this point, a couple of engineers from the RCA labs in Camden, New Jersey, Eric Berndt and John Maurer, decided to go out on their own and design and market an electrically operated 16mm film camera that could capture sound. They presented their machine to the Society of Motion Picture Engineers at their April 1940 gathering in Atlantic City. By that time, Eric Berndt and Walter Bach, the company's treasurer, were headed out west to Hollywood to introduce their new camera and sound system to the studios. They were probably figuring on a long, slow period of acceptance. But then this happened. The bombing of Pearl Harbor and America's entrance into the Second World War was a boon for 16mm film. Not only was the main raw material for film, nitrate, used for making explosives, the primary ingredient in celluloid before the advent of safety film, the nation was suddenly in need of instructional films to train up the new young recruits that would be fighting the battles. So not only was there scarcity of supply, but also increased demand. To this end, the E.M. Berndt Corporation introduced a new camera for the new reality in motion picture acquisition. It was called the Arricon. Made out of wood and able to run off 110 volts of electricity, the camera was described by cinematographer William Stoll in an April 1942 issue of American Cinematographer magazine as the ideal equipment for use by professional and governmental film units where portability, simplicity, and ruggedness are essentials. After the war, the company put the Arricon Pro on the market for around $1,200. Then, in the December 1949 ASC magazine, an ad appears for the Arricon Cinevoice. It only cost $700. This price point greatly appealed to managers at local TV broadcast stations who had to produce local news programs for their audience. Soon the camera was in nearly universal use around the country. The only problem was the small magazine. It only held 100 feet of film, about 2 minutes and 45 seconds worth of content. The solution was to chop the top of the camera off and re-weld the 400-foot Mitchell camera 16mm magazine back on, giving you nearly 10 minutes of footage. When D.A. Pennebaker handed a chopped Arricon with the ubiquitous 400-foot Mitchell magazine and a wide-angle lens on it to Albert Males in a small town in Wisconsin in August of 1959, to film the arrival of John F. Kennedy for a scene in the film Primary, the Cinevoice had become the standard documentary film camera in the United States. But as the 60s went on, the company didn't really improve upon the original designs of the cameras, and by 1969, the patent on the little Cinevoice had run out. This is where Ed Giulio entered the scene. Newly flush with his profits from his BNC reflex conversion, he turned his attention to the 16mm camera market. But he didn't go small, he incorporated all the modern updates in his new design, from electronics to ergonomics. He threw everything he could engineer at his new camera. Then he opened up a factory in Los Angeles at 2037 Granville Avenue and began mass producing them. He brought the first production model to the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers 110th Technical Conference and Equipment exhibit in Montreal in October of 1971. His announcement describes the camera as our lightweight 16mm camera for DC operation with magnesium housing for shoulder resting signal system magnetic sound recording, incorporating Bach Arricon center plate. The camera sold like hotcakes. Soon it was prevalent in most TV markets, and managers across the country had written further purchases of the $4,000 camera into future budgets of their stations. But Giulio wasn't done. He had some tricks up his sleeve. And in October of 1973, he brought his newest iteration of a 16mm camera to the Americana Hotel in New York, the CP16R. The R stood for reflex, as in through the lens viewing. The viewfinder used fiber optics and a spinning mirror mounted on the shutter to allow viewing through the lens while in the act of filming. Unlike in his reflex conversion for the Mitchell B&C, there was no light loss. And unlike the Arri, it was super quiet. It was also equipped with LED indicator lights for things like battery life, audio levels, and the amount of film left in the camera. It was a miracle design. There can be no doubt that folks seeing this American-made reflex 16mm camera with a cool magazine made out of the same material pro football helmets were made out of, thought that this would be a world-renowned tool in the work of image acquisition in the documentary film industry going forward. But there was another camera introduced that week, a camera that would render those predictions obsolete. A couple of days later, on Wednesday, October 17th, Joseph Flaherty with CBS gave a presentation on a new mode of image acquisition for news. It was a new way of doing things that would change the industry forever. Flaherty was born in Kansas City, Missouri in 1930. His father was the chief engineer of WDAF, the NBC-affiliated AM radio station owned by the Kansas City Star newspaper. The Star went into television in 1948 when Flaherty was 18, with an event at the Convention Center in downtown on September 11, 1949. It was estimated 10,000 people came by to witness the advent of the new technology. The studios were built south of town, beside a 724-foot tall radio tower, the tallest structure in the state at the time, taller even than the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. The station even had a mobile unit. Flaherty's dad was the chief engineer at the new TV station. That's him on the left in this picture. So he had a front row seat on the development of the new visual technology that was sweeping the nation at the time. After graduating from Rockhurst University with a degree in physics, he enlisted in the United States Army and reported to the Army Pictorial Center, which occupied the old Paramount Studios in Astoria, Queens. During his 2-year stint there, he built the Army their first TV station in the old special effects room. Afterwards, he returned home briefly to work for WDAF before being transferred up to corporate, taking a position at the RCA Labs in Camden. He was only there for a year before jumping ship and moving over to CBS. Then, in October of that year, this happened. The space race, which the launch of Sputnik brought about, occupied the minds of engineers all over the country, not to mention everyone else in the United States, for the next 15 years. For those working in the business of image acquisition, the ultimate goal was a camera on the first spacecraft to leave Earth orbit. Of course, RCA took the prize, sending a 4.5-pound camera up on Apollo 8 in December of 1968. The camera was equipped with a 160-degree wide-angle lens for interior stuff, a 100mm telephoto for exterior scenes. The live Christmas Eve flyover of the moon, as well as a live shot of full Earth on the way back, captured the imagination of an entire nation. By that December, smaller video cameras were all the rage. Ampex, the tape company, had joined up with ABC and designed the BC-100, which they unveiled to the world on November 11, 1967, at the USC versus UCLA football game. 10 months later, CBS unveiled theirs at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Here it can be seen making its way toward a dust-up on the convention floor during that contentious gathering. Flaherty was part of the team which was recognized with an Emmy Award for the camera design. Since CBS lacked the manufacturing capability of NBC and their parent company RCA, they had to look elsewhere to get the camera made on a large scale. So, on August 19, 1968, it was announced that Philips Norelco, headquartered in the city of Eindhoven in the Netherlands, would build the machine and distribute it. Flaherty spent the next couple of years trying to convince the studios making primetime programs to give up their film cameras and their one-time use celluloid strip for a new electronic means of image capture, possible with their new portable camera and a reusable format. At the spring conference of the Society in 1970 and 71, he, along with Kenneth Taylor of CMX Systems, pitched a video capture system designed to cut costs for primetime production while maintaining a high-quality production. While this was going on, another manufacturer Flaherty was working with overseas, Fernseh, their German version of RCA, took their camera made in partnership with CBS, loaned it to the German Institute for Broadcast Technology, who then took it to the Southwest Broadcasting Studios of the Regional Public Broadcasting Corporation in Baden-Baden, and designed a test to compare the picture quality attained from their camera to 35 and 16mm film. The results of the test were unveiled in October of 1971 at the Society's 110th conference. The demonstration was so impressive that Flaherty repeated it a couple of times in the next few months. By the summer of 1972, though, Eastman Kodak had started to push back, claiming that the 16mm film used in the American version of the demonstration was different from the one that was used in Germany, and that the American film had a different exposure index. Also, they took issue with the film-to-video transfer in the later experiments. So Flaherty took the camera into the Lion's Den, Kodak Park in Rochester, New York, to put the electronic means of image capture up against the old mechanical means. He then showed the results on the last day of the Society's 112th Technical Conference held at the Century City Hotel in Los Angeles. A roundtable discussion entitled The Great Film Tape Debate, Coexistence or Conflict, was planned. In the report about the symposium that came out a few months later, it was reported, on the color monitor, the 16mm and 35mm film clips differed very little in sharpness and quality, but the videotape had consistently better sharpness and color. On the projection screen, however, differences between the 16mm and 35mm films were more apparent. and the tape-to-film transfers did not compare well to the film negative to film positive clips. The discussion indicated that the nature of the original production will determine which medium is used for the original shooting. Subsequent conversations will then depend on the requirement of the organization distributing the programming. But Flaherty, during his remarks at the roundtable discussion, pointed out there were other areas besides major motion picture features and primetime productions where video and film were, going forward, have to coexist or cancel each other out, namely in the production of commercials and in the acquisition of news imagery. To this end, at the start of 1973, CBS placed one of its new portable video cameras in each of their owned and operated local affiliate stations. Flaherty then spent the year compiling the effects these cameras had in news coverage in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, and Los Angeles. He brought those results to the Society's New York convention in 1973. During his presentation on electronic news gathering, he demonstrated the cost savings that could be accomplished with a reusable format like tape against a one-and-done format like film. He admitted that while the upfront cost of the video system was steep, the sheer amount of film shot, physically transported, then processed would make up for the cost in the long run. He also pointed out the editorial benefits accrued from the instantaneous nature of electronic news gathering. He then introduced a new camera, made to CBS specifications for the rough and tumble world of news gathering, the Ikigami HL33. This camera was made by another overseas partner to the south of Tokyo in Japan, in a community called Oda City, the land of 1,000 factories.
Near the center of Oda City Ward is a Buddhist temple called Ikigami Hanmanji. It was here that the Buddhist priest Nichiren died in 1282 while visiting his supporter, Ikigami Munenaka, who was an important vassal to the ruling shogunate of the time. Ikigami subsequently donated his land for a temple to the priest's disciples. After this, the area around the temple became known simply as Ikigami. When the 5-story pagoda was built atop the hill in 1608, it was the tallest structure on the Kanto plain. But still, the area was outside the Tokyo metropolis. It wasn't until the 1923 Kanto earthquake, during which the east side of Tokyo was destroyed by fire, that the area received a huge influx of new residents. 9 years after this, Ikigami was incorporated into a new suburban ward named Aomori. That same year, Tokyo Technical Institute was established at the northwestern edge of the ward, while Haneda Airport was established to the south. 16 years later, following the carnage of World War II, the district was again organized into a new ward called Oda City. It was one of the largest of Tokyo's wards, and it soon became an important center of industrial output. The factories in Oda City are small, as seen in this photograph from the yearly factory tour that's held to promote the area's broad know-how in manufacturing. Usually they only have a staff of a half dozen or so. This community of industrialists practices a system they call Nakama Mawashi, which translates to work passed among associates. It is sometimes called a bicycle network. It was said that if you threw a paper airplane with a design written on it through a window of a small factory in Oda City, you'd have a completed product the next day. It is no wonder Sony established themselves in an old warehouse about 3 miles north of the Ikigami Temple after the war, and then that Canon established their headquarters about 1.5 miles to the south. Meanwhile, the year Oda City was being set up, about 700 yards to the south of the Ikigami Temple, Kosai Seido established Ikigami Tushinki Shisakusho. The English translation is Ikigami New Manufacturing Company. By 1951, they started making TV studio equipment and delivered their first portable video cameras to CBS in 1962, where they were used in St. Louis and Florida on the Mercury Project, and as a third camera during the Beatles' February 1964 Ed Sullivan appearance in Miami. By 1973, they delivered their next creation to CBS, the HL33. The HL stood for Handy Looky and was most likely a nod to the 1952 RCA design for a portable camera called the Walkie Looky. The HL33 was a little over a foot long, 7.5 inches high, and 4 inches wide. It only weighed 12 pounds, about the same as the CP16, but, and there's always a but, in order to be mobile, the operator had to wear a pack that weighed 22 pounds. Plus, you still needed to cable to a recorder, which at this date was back in the truck or at the station, because news stations hadn't yet adopted the Sony 3/4-inch cassette in their news gathering system. All in all, not a system one would assume station managers would be eager to adapt. Still, Flaherty ended his presentation with the prediction that capital costs on the portable color camera and videotape recorder equipment will drop from the present figure of $40,000, and that this will usher in a period of dramatic growth in electronic news gathering both domestically and abroad.
One can question whether he meant that. October of 1973 was not a great economic period for the United States. The stock market had been going down since the beginning of the year, and right before the conference, the Yom Kippur War had just started. Due to timely aid given to Israel in the initial days of the conflict, oil-producing nations in the Middle East were preparing to cut exports to the United States. The next month, the country would sink into a recession, the worst since World War II. Not only that, but two professors at the Ohio State University had sent out questionnaires to newsroom managers around the country asking about their future plans for equipment purchases. And it was almost a universal response that nobody was going into electronic news gathering anytime soon. So it can be assumed that the mood toward film at the conference that week was pretty positive.
For example, at his lunch address on the first day of the conference, Byron Rodebush, president of Eastman Kodak, pointed out that 85% of primetime programming was shot on film, an increase from years prior, and he was exceptionally bullish on Eastman Kodak's future, predicting the president of Eastman Kodak would be back to address the conference in 2016. As for Giulio and his CP16R, it was being ready to film one of the first miniseries on American television, Sandberg's Lincoln. The camera had been chosen for this production because it was the quietest film camera on the market.
Are you going to be president?
I think the votes are there. There's the animal himself.
Meanwhile, the HL33 was barely mentioned in the trades following the camera's coming out party at the NAB show in Houston in 1974.
Within a year, film was being unceremoniously tossed into the ash heap of history. If you want to know the events which caused the prevailing wisdom at the time to be wrong, you'll have to buy my book, The Last Days of Film and the Rise of Electronic News Gathering, or wait for my next video on the subject in about 8 months.
I'd like to thank YouTuber Miklos for the curtain effect, YouTuber Sam Dodge for sprucing up all those Mitchell cameras and then making videos about them, the Texas Archive of the Moving Image, and Larry Weidman of KPRC in Houston, Texas, World Radio History for maintaining an archive of all those broadcast trade journals, the American Society of Cinematographers for making their catalog available online, and of course the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers for hosting the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers Digital Library. Links to these sources can be found in the description below.
And of course, I'd like to thank you for watching. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to know when my next video comes out.
Did you know that while Giulio was executing all those conversions to all those BNCs for through-the-lens viewing, he was also converting some non-reflex cameras for Stanley Kubrick, which would accept an exceptional 50mm Zeiss lens with a 0.7 f-stop. For the film Barry Lyndon, want to know more? Order a copy of The Last Days of Film and the Rise of Electronic News Gathering, available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Links in the description below. And finally, here are a couple more videos on the subject of electronic news gathering.